Every machine gun in the Second World War music was a strategic decision before it was a battlefield weapon. Ordnance boards controlled them, not out of ignorance, but arithmetic. A single automatic weapon consumed more ammunition in 10 minutes than a rifleman fired all day. Every barrel, every music belt link, every spare part added weight to supply chains already at breaking point, so institutions restricted them. But battlefields do not operate on balanced sheets. These are the 10 machine guns command music tried to limit and the soldiers who carried them anyway. Number 10. M191919A6 Browning. The replacement no one asked for. The United Music States needed a light machine gun. What it got instead was a compromise bolted together from a weapon that was never designed for the role. By 1943, the M1919A4 Browning was a proven gun, belt-fed, reliable, and devastatingly effective from a fixed position. But it was a medium machine gun. Music. It needed a tripod, a crew, and time to set up. In the fluid, fast-moving combat of North Africa and the Pacific, that setup time cost music lives. What the infantry needed was a true light machine gun, music something portable, shoulder-fired, deployable in seconds. What the Ordnance Department wanted was a clean sheet design, something to rival the German MG-34 and MG-42. But the infantry board overruled them. There was no time for development. The solution had to come now. So they bolted a bipod, a shoulder stock, music, and a carrying handle onto the M191919A4 and called it the M1919A6. It was classified as substitute standard, a designation that told every soldier who received one exactly how much confidence music the institution had in its own creation. The weapon weighed 32 lb, heavier in fact, than the gun it was supposed to improve. Its barrel change procedure was awkward compared to nearly every light machine gun in music service elsewhere. The Ordnance Department openly resented having the project forced upon them by the Infantry Board. And yet, despite its substitute, music standard classification, over 43,000 were built. Troops carried them across France, through the Pacific, and into Germany. Not because the gun was ideal, but because it was there, and because belt-fed fire from a portable position was better than waiting for a tripod that might never arrive. The M99191919191919191919191919A6 was nobody's first choice, but soldiers carried it forward regardless because in a war where the right weapon arrived late, a compromise that worked now outweighed perfection that existed only on paper. Number 9. The Laki Saloranta M26, Finland's reluctant machine gun. Finland went to war against the Soviet Union in 1939, carrying a light machine gun its own officers had already lost confidence in. The Laki Saloranta M26 was beautifully machined, mechanically precise, music and almost entirely wrong for the war Finland was about to fight. Designed in the 1920s by Imolati Music and Arvo Saller, it was meant to give Finnish infantry squads organic automatic fire. On paper, it delivered a recoil-operated weapon, firing the 7.62x 54mm cartridge from a 20-round box magazine. In controlled conditions, it was accurate and reliable. In finished snow, mud, and sub-zero temperatures, the story changed. The weapon's tight tolerances made it vulnerable to fouling. Its magazine capacity was half that of the Soviet DP-27 it faced across the line, reloading under fire with a 20-round box while Soviet squads poured drum-fed automatic fire into your position was not a theoretical disadvantage. It was a survival problem. Finnish troops increasingly preferred captured Soviet weapons or requested the Suomi submachine gun for close-range engagements. Music military planners recognized the deficiencies but lacked the industrial capacity music to replace the M26 entirely. Production continued through necessity rather than confidence, and soldiers carried it because nothing better was available in sufficient numbers. In the forests around Suomussalmi, where Finnish ski troops ambushed entire Soviet divisions in temperatures that cracked metal, the Laki Sailor was still the weapon in their hands. Music. When the Continuation War began in 1941, it remained in service, still limited, still tolerated, and still filling a role its own army wished it could assign to something else. Even after institutional resistance had been documented at every level, Finnish soldiers carried the M26 forward because the alternative was no automatic fire at all. If the weapon you were issued had already been written off by your own officers, would you carry it anyway or trust the system to replace it? Number 8. The Shayot reissued in World War II, the relic that returned. No machine gun entered the Second World War more despised than the Shah. The French CSRG model 1915 earned its infamy in the trenches of the First World War. A long recoil automatic rifle notorious for jamming, misfiring, and breaking under conditions that every other weapon was expected to endure. By 1940, the Shia should have been a museum piece. Instead, when Germany invaded France, desperate mobilization pulled thousands from storage and placed them back into the hands of reservists, colonial troops, and second-line units who had no other automatic weapon available. Documented reports, music, indicate that shots were issued to French territorial divisions and colonial formations during the fall of France. Some were carried into the field by units defending the Maginino Line's flanks and by troops rushed forward during the chaotic retreat of June 1940. The weapon's open-sided magazine still collected dirt. Its parts still wore unpredictably. Soldiers who received one understood exactly what it meant about their place in the Army's priorities. The weapon fired the 8mm level cartridge from a 20-round magazine at a rate that was low even by Great War standards. Its long recoil action, where the entire barrel traveled rearward with the bolt, produced a violent lurching rhythm that made accurate automatic fire nearly impossible. Soldiers learned to fire in short, deliberate bursts and to keep their fingers away from the magazine. Well, after France fell, Shahs appeared again in the hands of resistance fighters, Vichy colonial garrisons, and partisan groups across occupied Europe who took whatever they could find. It was never reissued with pride. It was reissued because warehouses' music still held them, and a flawed automatic weapon was still better than a bolt-action rifle when the enemy was already at the gates. Number 7. The WWII. Field violations the gun soldiers broke to music make work. Italy's standard light machine gun of the Second World War was a weapon its own troops learned to distrust almost immediately. The Brada Modello 30 fed from a fixed hinged magazine that opened to the side for loading with 20-round stripper clips. A system so awkward that soldiers in North Africa and the Balkans routinely violated standing orders to modify their weapons in the field. The Brada 30 required oiled cartridges to function reliably, a design choice that attracted sand and grit in desert conditions. Its feed system was fragile, its rate of fire inconsistent, and its 20-round capacity was entirely insufficient for the suppression role a light machine gun was expected to fill. Italian soldiers responded with improvisation. Documented cases music described troops filing feed components, modifying the magazine hinge, and attempting to adapt the weapon to accept different ammunition or loading methods. None of these modifications were authorized. Some made the weapon marginally more reliable. Others introduced new failure points that armorers warned could be catastrophic. In the Western Desert, where Italian divisions fought alongside Rommel's Afrika Korps, Breda 30 crews were documented stripping parts from captured British Bren guns in attempts to improve their own weapons' feeding reliability. Despite official prohibitions against field modification, the Italian army knew the Breda 30 was inadequate, but lacked the industrial resources to replace it at scale. Production continued, allocation continued, and soldiers continued to carry a weapon they trusted only after they had altered it themselves. The Breda 30 was the gun music Italy gave its soldiers. What soldiers carried into battle was something the army never approved. Music number 6, the MG-15 ground conversion, the aircraft gun on the front line. The MG-15 was never designed to be carried by infantry. Built by Rheinmetall as a flexible mount defensive weapon for Luftwaffe aircraft, it fired the standard 7.92mm Mauser cartridge from a distinctive 75-round saddle drum at over 1,000 rounds per minute. By 1941, faster-firing belt-fed weapons like the MG-81 and heavier caliber guns had rendered the MG-15 obsolete in its original role. Thousands sat in Luftwaffe stores, functional, surplus, and suddenly available. The conversion was straightforward, but far from ideal. A simple buttstock was added to the receiver, a bipod fitted near the barrel, and revised iron sights installed for ground-level engagement. The result was an overly long, awkward weapon that lacked a quick-change barrel and emptied its magazine in under 5 seconds of sustained fire. Official records indicate that by January 1944, over 17,000 MG-15s had been converted for ground use. They were issued to Luftwaffe field divisions, rear area security units, and eventually to Volkerm formations in the war's final months. They were never intended to replace the MG-34 or MG-42. They were intended to fill music gaps that Germany's collapsing production could no longer close. Soldiers carried them because the alternative was no automatic weapon at all. Though never approved as a frontline infantry weapon, the MG-15 ended up in the hands of men fighting on the Eastern Front, Music in the Balkans, and in the final defense of German soil. The MG-15 wasn't built for the infantry, but the infantry didn't get to choose. It would be easy at this point to frame every restriction as failure, Music as bureaucrats standing between soldiers and survival. But the truth was more measured than that. Machine guns consumed resources at Music, a rate no other infantry weapon could match. Ammunition, barrels, training, Music logistics. Every automatic weapon multiplied the burden on supply chains already fracturing under the weight of global war. Ordnance boards weren't always wrong to hesitate. Production limits weren't always irrational. Music. Every weapon denied had a reason. Every reason had a Music price. And the weapons that follow represent the sharpest edge of that tension where the gap between what institutions approved and what soldiers needed became impossible to ignore. At what point does caution stop Music being strategy and start costing lives? Number 5. The Johnson M1941 light machine gun. The Ordnance Department's problem. Melvin Johnson was a Marine Corps Reserve officer, a lawyer by training, and a firearms designer whose creations threatened to embarrass one of the most powerful institutions in the American military. His M1941 light machine gun weighed just over 12 lb, nearly 8 lb lighter than the Browning automatic rifle it could have supplemented. It featured a quick change barrel, Music, an adjustable rate of fire, and a recoil-operated mechanism that kept the weapon remarkably controllable under automatic fire. The Army Ordnance Department wanted nothing to do with it. The Johnson had never been formally tested by the Army. Its existence challenged the bar, a weapon the Ordnance Department had already invested heavily in Music and had no interest in replacing. Political maneuvering, institutional pride, and the sheer momentum of existing production lines kept the Johnson from serious Army consideration. But the Marine Corps saw value even after the Army's resistance was made clear. Paramarine battalions adopted the Johnson LMG in limited numbers, and it saw combat in the Solomon Islands and later with the 1st Special Service Force at Anzio. Despite allocation that remained restricted throughout the war, Marines praised its lightweight, its accuracy, and its ability to sustain fire far longer than the bar before overheating. Only around 9,500 were Music ever produced. The weapon remained a footnote, not because it failed, but because the Music institution that could have championed it refused to acknowledge what a Marine officer and civilian lawyer had built in a textile factory in Rhode Island. The Johnson didn't lose on the battlefield. It lost in the boardroom. Number 4. The Stinger NM2 conversion. Music, the gun that was never approved. In the Pacific, Marines faced a problem no official weapon solved. The M1919 was too heavy to carry on the assault. The BR lacked sustained firepower, Music, and the Japanese were dug into positions that demanded overwhelming close-range automatic fire delivered by men who could move. The answer came not from an arsenal or a procurement office, but from wrecked aircraft scattered across Pacific airstrips. Music. The ANM-2 was the .30 caliber aircraft machine gun fitted to the rear defensive positions of dive bombers like the SPD Dauntless. It weighed only 21 lbs, a third lighter than the infantry Browning, and fired at 350 rounds per minute, more than double the rate of the M1919A4. Marines salvaged these guns from damaged aircraft and began converting them for ground use. The first attempts were crude. A bipod was bolted to the muzzle and the original spade grips were retained. Later, Sergeant Milan Grevich and Private First Class John Little built a refined version using a cut-down M1 Garand stock, a fabricated trigger assembly, and a bar bipod. 6 of these finished Stingers were carried into the invasion of Iwo Jima. None of this was authorized by any procurement channel. The Stinger existed entirely outside the official supply system. Corporal Tony Stein carried one onto the beaches of Iwo Jima on the 19th of February 1945, using it to destroy multiple pillboxes and provide covering fire across 8 separate ammunition runs. each time sprinting back to the beach under fire, each time carrying a wounded Marine to safety. He was killed in action 10 days later and was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. After the war, the surviving Stingers were presumably destroyed. The military had no interest in keeping non-standard equipment on its books. A weapon that had earned a Medal of Honor vanished because no institution had ever approved it in the first place. Number 3. The DP-27. Early production resistance. The drum-fed gamble. When Vasile de Thiario presented his light machine gun design to Soviet military authorities in the late 1920s, it was met with skepticism that had less to do with engineering and more to do with doctrine. The Soviet military establishment favored heavier water, cooled weapons, and a lightweight air-cooled, drum-fed machine gun challenged existing tactical assumptions about how automatic fire should be deployed at the squad level. Early production of the DP-27 was limited and allocation was cautious. The weapon's 47-round pan magazine was fragile. Its flat design made it vulnerable to bending if dropped or stepped on, and a damaged magazine rendered the weapon useless. The bipod legs were thin and prone, music, to spreading under recoil. Soviet planners questioned whether a weapon this light could deliver the sustained fire their doctrine demanded. But the DP-27 had one quality that overrode every institutional concern. It was simple to produce. Music. As the Soviet Union industrialized at breakneck speed through the 1930s, the DP-27 proved it could be manufactured by factories with limited tooling and semi-skilled labor. By the time Germany invaded in 1941, the weapon had become the backbone of Soviet squad-level firepower. Carried forward despite early institutional skepticism, despite the fragility of its magazines, despite the reservations of officers who had favored heavier designs, not because every officer trusted it, but because the factories could deliver it faster than anything else. Soldiers carried it across every front of the Eastern War. Its flaws were real. Magazines bent, bipods buckled, and sustained fire demanded a discipline the weapon's design did not forgive. But a flawed machine gun in the hands of every squad was worth more than a perfect one that never arrived. Its presence was irreplaceable. The DP-27 became the rhythm of Soviet infantry, the steady, measured pulse of automatic fire that covered every advance and anchored every defense from Moscow to Berlin. Number 2, the MG-34 production restrictions. The gun too expensive to win. The MG-34 was the weapon that proved a single machine gun could serve every role an infantry force required. As a light machine gun, a medium machine gun, an anti-aircraft weapon, and a vehicle mount, it was the world's first true general-purpose machine gun. And when it entered service in the mid-1930s, it gave the Wehrmacht a tactical advantage no other army could match. Germany could never build enough of them. The MG-34 demanded precision machining on a scale that strained even Germany's formidable industrial base. Each weapon required extensive milling, hand-fitting, and quality control that consumed hours of skilled labor. In a war that devoured material faster than any nation could produce it, the MG-34 was a masterpiece Germany couldn't afford to mass-produce. Production restrictions were imposed not by tactical choice but by industrial reality. The weapon was expensive, slow to manufacture, and demanded raw materials that were increasingly scarce. The MG-42 was developed specifically to address this, a weapon that could be stamped, pressed, and assembled faster and cheaper. But even after the MG-42 entered service, the MG-34 was never fully replaced. Though production was repeatedly curtailed and resources redirected, it remained in manufacture throughout the war, serving in roles where the MG-42 couldn't, particularly as a coaxial and hull-mounted weapon in armored vehicles. Soldiers and vehicle crews relied on it long after the institution had decided its cost was unsustainable. German soldiers carried the MG-34 from Poland to Stalingrad, from the deserts of North Africa to the hedge of Normandy. On the bipod, it gave squads portable suppression. On the tripod, it became a devastating medium machine gun capable of sustained long-range fire that could pin entire companies. Its quality was never in question, only its cost. The MG-34 was the gun that defined modern infantry tactics. It was also the gun that proved even the finest music weapon means nothing if you can't build it fast enough to win. If a weapon gave you a decisive edge, but your own command tried to limit it, would you follow the regulation or the battlefield? Number 1, music. The FG-42, the weapon the Army tried to limit. In 1942, Germany's Fallschirmjäger, its music elite paratroopers, demanded a weapon that did not exist anywhere in the world. After the catastrophic losses on Cree, music, where airborne troops landed with pistols and submachine guns while their rifles dropped separately in containers, the Luftwaffe commissioned a weapon that would combine the precision of a battle rifle with the firepower of a light machine gun in music, a single compact parachute deployable package. The result was the FG-42. The moment it appeared, the German army tried to kill it. The FG-42 was not an army project. It was a Luftwaffe project developed outside Army ordnance channels, funded by Luftwaffe budgets, and designed to specifications, music the Army had never approved. It fired the full-power 7.92x 57mm cartridge from a side-mounted magazine. Music could switch between semi-automatic and fully automatic fire, and weighed under 10 lb. Its inline stock, pistol grip, and integrated bipod anticipated assault rifle concepts. Music that would not become standard for decades. The Army resisted it on every front. It was too expensive. Its machining was too complex. Its ammunition consumption was unsustainable. And perhaps most critically, it represented a Luftwaffe intrusion into ground weapons development that Army ordnance viewed as a direct institutional threat. Production was severely restricted. Estimates suggest that no more than 7,000 were ever manufactured, music, across two distinct variants, the early Type 1 and the revised Type 2, before Allied bombing and material music shortages made further production impossible for a weapon intended to arm an elite fighting force. Those numbers were a fraction of what the failure needed. Most German soldiers, music, never saw one. Most never knew it existed. But the paratroopers who carried it at Music Montic Casino in Normandy in the final desperate months of the war knew exactly what they held. A weapon so advanced that American engineers studied captured examples while developing the M60 machine gun. A weapon whose inline layout, select fire capability, and operating principles influenced infantry rifle design for the rest of the century. The FG-42 was the most institutionally contested weapon of the Second World War. Resisted by the Army, restricted by production, and limited by the very politics of who was allowed to build weapons for whom. It was born from a need the system refused music to acknowledge, developed through channels the establishment tried to close, and carried into battle by men who understood that survival does not wait for institutional approval. It was the weapon the Army music tried to kill. The paratroopers carried it anyway, and the future of infantry warfare followed where they led. If you value serious documented analysis of the weapons that shaped the Second World War, consider subscribing. Every machine gun on this list carried more than ammunition. It carried a decision made not in a boardroom or a factory, but in the space between doctrine and survival. Institutions resist change by design. They must. The logistics of global war demanded standardization, predictability, and music control. Every non-standard weapon, every unauthorized modification, every production expansion that was not planned introduced risk into a system already fracturing under the weight of total war. But there is another kind of risk, the kind that never appears on a requisition form, the risk of carrying the wrong weapon into a fight that does not care what the manual says. Music. The men who carried these guns understood that. They understood it not as theory, but as the cold arithmetic of a moment when doctrine offered one answer and the battlefield demanded another. They chose the battlefield, and the institutions that tried to limit them were in the end changed by the very weapons they resisted. That is the quiet truth of every war. The men who fight it carry forward what the men who plan it tried to leave behind.